Chapter 537, Excessive Spiritual Perception. Behind the door was a bare-chested man with a hideous blue sea serpent tattooed on his arm and short streaks of red paint, painted on the sides of his cheeks, chest, and abdomen, each group formed out of 3 streaks. Really exotic. However, aren't you afraid of being too conspicuous? Aren't you afraid of being caught by the police while you're outside? You're part of the resistance that engages in secret operations. Klein was about to retract his gaze when he was almost forced to frown by the man's thick, messy eyebrows and cold-blooded eyes. He has killed many people. Klein made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. Honestly speaking, due to his previous life's identity and knowledge, he initially held a lot of sympathy for the rebels under colonial rule, having no sense of belonging as a Lonese. However, after hearing that the man and the followers of the sea god Kalvatua basically engaged in the same acts, he became even more wary and repulsed. This wasn't to say that he discriminated against the local faith, but rather, he understood that the traditional faith of all the colonial islands was still in a primitive stage that believed in sacrifice. They worshipped with blood, using living sacrifices, and were still in a state of complete ignorance. In addition, with the experiences of the Emperor and myself, the beyonder nature of this world is filled with madness and twistedness. A deity, still in the primitive stage of sacrifice, is basically unable to resist this trend. It's quite obvious what kind of style they follow. Without a word, Klein followed Danitz into the room. "Edmonton, who's here?" A mild voice sounded from the area near the windows. The tattooed man closed the door and said, "They've disguised themselves." At that moment, Klein had taken a good look at the situation in the room and gained a basic understanding of it. The living room wasn't very large. A cupboard, a table, and a few chairs were enough to make it look cramped. To the right were 2 doors leading to what appeared to be a bedroom. To the left was a kitchen, separated by a cabinet. As for the washroom, there was no doubt that there wasn't one. When Klein went upstairs, he discovered that there was a common washroom at the corner of each flight of stairs. The stench of them not being washed for extended periods of time urged any passers-by to walk up faster. Directly in front of him was a window. 2 bamboo poles hung out and were used to hang a lot of clothes to dry. There were 4 or 5 men sitting or standing in the bedroom's doorway and the living room. All of them were dark-skinned natives with slightly curly hair. They wore dark blue taraba shirts and more or less had red paint on their bare skin, and as for the sea serpent tattoo, Klein couldn't tell if it was there or not because of the clothing. Some of them had revolvers at their waists, some carrying brownish-red hunting rifles. Some even carried gray steel backpacks and long, thick high-pressure steam rifles. They formed a semicircle around Danitz and Klein, who had just entered the room. The person who spoke was a wheelchair-bound man in his 40s. He wore a jacket and had a blanket over his knees. He had a shaved head, a slightly green beard on both sides of his face, and his dark brown eyes were calm and collected. He glanced at his visitor and slowly smiled. "Blazing." Danitz was stunned for a moment before forcing out a laugh. "Kallet, you have a good eye." "Dogshit, am I so bad at disguising myself?" He roared inwardly, unwilling to accept the fact. Kallet ignored Blazing's insincere praise and instead chuckled. "I heard that you killed Steel and Blood Brambles." "How else would they be dead?" Danitz retorted without hesitation. Kallet narrowed his eyes, slowly shifting his gaze to Klein, who had a featureless face. He knew very well that Blazing Danitz alone would have a hard time killing Blood Brambles Hendry, much less Steel Mavetti. His success was rumored to be due to the help of a powerful adventurer, a seasoned bounty hunter. Is it the person beside him? When he looked into Klein's eyes, he didn't see any nervousness, worry, or vigilance. Those eyes were like a deep ocean. It could very well be. At the very least, he's stronger than Blazing. He signaled to Edmonton and the others with his eyes, secretly informing them to be on their guard. "What are you doing here?" Kallet didn't pursue the subject. Danitz subconsciously looked at Klein, and after seeing his nod of affirmation, he replied, "Here to see what good things you have to offer." Kallet pointed to a table and said, "It's all placed there." There were many strange and different items laid out, including a whistle made of bone, a simple and crude bagpipe, an iron-black leaf, and a rock stained with blood. Without waiting for Klein and Danitz to examine the items, Kallet clapped his hands and said, "I have a mission. If you can complete it, you can freely choose an item from these at no additional cost." He laughed and added, "By the definition of you foreigners, they aren't mystical objects, but they all have some supernatural power, but it will slowly, yes, slowly weaken until it disappears." "What mission?" Klein asked calmly, having no intention of hiding the fact that Danitz was only a follower. He reached into the blanket that extended to his knees and took out a stack of white paper. "Find out where they are. If you can catch them directly, you will get even more." He raised his arms and began to display lifelike portraits, including a lady with greenish-gray eyes dressed in a man's shirt. Letitia Dolra. Klein recognized who the Resistance was looking for at a glance. It was the female archaeologist and adventurer he had met last night and had boarded the same ship with this morning. She was suspected to be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order or the Element Dawn. Danitz looked at it closely for 2 seconds and found the picture vaguely familiar. Suddenly, he remembered where he had seen her before. Jayaman Sparrow had shown it in his dreams. He had just asked the captain about it in the afternoon, and were already bumping into something relevant in the evening. Isn't he too resourceful at gathering information? Danitz resisted his urge to glance at the crazy adventurer beside him, afraid that Kallet and Edmonton would notice something amiss. He was very experienced in this area. The Resistance, who believe in the sea god, are looking for Letitia. The faith of the sea god spreads throughout the Rørsted archipelago, including Saimim. There was a snake last night. The image of the sea god is that of a gigantic sea serpent. Klein superimposed the two matters together and quickly came to a preliminary conclusion. Archaeologist Letitia and company had obtained an important item involving the sea god in the Forgotten Temple in the ancient forest of Saimim Island. Hence, it resulted in last night's probing and the Resistance's search. Klein thought for a moment, then he gave a perfunctory reply, "I'll keep an eye out. I won't randomly get myself involved in matters related to evil spirits. Of course, if it's necessary, then I will report it to the officials." He silently added a few words inwardly. Kallet nodded and said, "Take a look first and see if there's anything you want." Klein walked over and was just about to inquire as he made his selection when he suddenly sensed something and subconsciously looked towards the right side of the item pile. There was a short sword made of thin bones. It was slightly longer than a forearm and had a milky white body. There were a few dark red deep stripes on it. "It can trigger my spiritual perception." Klein stretched out his right hand in an attempt to pick up the sharp bone sword that was placed right at the front to carefully examine it. The moment his fingers touched the bone sword, cries of despair and pain suddenly echoed in his mind. A thick stench of blood faintly appeared at the tip of his nose, and he seemed to see many distorted and rotten illusory figures that were covered in mucus. Klein's forehead ached, as though he had been pierced by a needle, and he subconsciously retracted his finger. A little sinister, it's not a simple item. Klein, who had experienced things far more intense before, only showed a slight change in expression. He resisted the urge to activate his spirit vision, afraid that he would see something he shouldn't. Noticing this, Kallet exchanged glances with Edmonton and said with a smile, "This bone sword is capable of draining an enemy's blood. It's not bad. Do you want it?" "A little proactive." Klein frowned, relaxed his brows immediately, and then he said in a deep voice, "No, there's nothing I want here." If Kallet hadn't asked, he was even planning on buying the bone sword and researching it above the gray fog. However, the fact that the man promoted it had left him vigilant. Thus, he rationally abandoned his original plans. Kallet crossed his hands and said, "It's not expensive at all. Or would you like to look at something else?" "There's no need." Klein's pupils shrank suddenly as he turned and walked straight towards the door. Danitz hesitated momentarily before hurrying after him. Edmonton, who had a sea serpent tattoo on his arm, watched silently. He seemed as if he would reach out and stop them at any moment, but in the end, he didn't do anything. They were the powerful adventurers who had killed Steel Mavetti and Blood Brambles Hendry. Once out of the room, Klein stomped down the stairs without saying a word. Danitz ran after him, alarmed. Based on his take of the situation, he didn't inquire about the situation and only followed. The two quickly returned to the square, and the crowd which had gathered once again to either kneel or prostrate scattered once more. But unlike before, there was a man who had still remained kneeling on the ground, motionless. Klein didn't even glance at him as he walked past without stopping. However, Danitz had taken a subconscious look, only to discover that the man's face was as dry as a weathered rock. Pah! A piece of flesh from the man's cheek fell to the ground. It was a piece of grayish skin with facial hair attached to it. He seemed to have lost all the moisture in his body. Danitz was startled and didn't dare to look again, feeling that things had become strange and dangerous at some point. The two of them passed through the alleys, left the city, and boarded a rental carriage. The carriage driver was obviously a native, around 40 years old, and his laughter was very pleasing. But along the way, he didn't say a word. It was so quiet that it made Danitz feel like his heart was beating like a drum. Klein pursed his lips and remained silent. The rental carriage quickly arrived at the dock area. In order to change his attire, Danitz got it to stop a distance from Acid Lemon Street. After getting off the carriage, Klein didn't pay the fare or stop. He immediately took large strides and left, leaving Danitz stunned. He tossed 2 soldi to the carriage driver and hurriedly chased after Jayaman Sparrow. After a few steps, he looked back and saw the driver kneeling down with a face full of zeal and devoutness. He leaned over the ground and kissed the ground where Klein had stepped.